Space is never truly silent, but when the alien fleet finished its maneuver around Earth, the quiet that followed felt intentional, controlled, and absolute. The sun still burned at the heart of the system, its light spilling across the blue curve of the planet. But now that light passed through layers of foreign metal and energy fields so vast, they distorted the sky itself. Thousands of warships locked into position along Earth's orbital plane, forming a seamless ring that closed like a fist. No weapons charged, no warnings were transmitted. The fleet did not announce itself because it did not need to. Its presence alone rewrote the meaning of the word inevitable. Every human sensor, from civilian observatories to classified deep space arrays, confirmed the same conclusion within seconds. Earth was no longer part of open space. It had been sealed out to the galaxy. This was not an act of war. It was procedure. The fleet belonged to an ancient coalition that had refined domination into something quieter and far more effective than violence. They did not burn worlds. They isolated them. They did not slaughter populations. They waited. Trade lanes were cut, communication corridors jammed, and reinforcement vectors denied until entire civilizations collapsed inward under their own weight. The method was flawless because it exploited a universal weakness. Most species could endure pain, but few could endure uncertainty. Isolation bred fear, fear bred division, and division ended resistance. Earth, according to every psychological model the coalition possessed, fit the pattern perfectly. Humans were volatile, emotionally driven, politically fractured, and historically self-destructive. The blockade was not meant to defeat them. It was meant to let them defeat themselves. On Earth, the sky became a ceiling. In major cities, people stopped in the streets to stare upward as alien holes eclipsed familiar constellations, their silhouettes stretching across the atmosphere like scars. Ocean reflections showed shapes that did not belong to nature. Civilian air traffic halted almost instantly. Satellites rerouted or went dark as foreign interference overwhelmed orbital lanes. Governments declared global emergencies within minutes, activating protocols that had never been tested outside simulations. Military commands brought dormant systems online, some of them older than the officers authorizing their use. Scientists recalculated trajectories they already knew were hopeless, confirming again and again that every known exit vector was sealed. Jump points were blocked. Probe signals vanished at the perimeter. Earth was no longer a participant in the galaxy. It was a subject under observation. Fear existed, but it did not explode the way the coalition expected. Communication networks did not collapse into panic. Markets froze, then stabilized. Emergency broadcasts went out, but they carried instructions, not hysteria. People stayed indoors. Infrastructure held. The planet did not scream. It breathed. From orbit, alien analysts watched human data traffic with growing confusion. Power grids did not spike wildly. Civilian networks rerouted rather than overloaded. Military chatter was disciplined, minimal, and deliberately compartmentalized. Earth was not behaving like a cornered species. It was behaving like a system shifting into a different operational mode inside the alien command ships. This calm was misinterpreted as denial. Coalition strategists had seen the stage before. A brief period of composure always preceded collapse. Humans, they assumed, had not yet grasped the permanence of the situation. Once shortages began, once external silence stretched into weeks, then months, unity would fracture. Internal conflict would follow. It always did. The fleet settled into long-duration positions. Crews rotating through shifts designed for endurance rather than combat. No one rushed. Time was their weapon, and time, they believed, was infinite. What they failed to notice was where humanity's attention was focused. Earth was not looking inward. It was looking outward. Deep space sensors were not shut down. They were refined. Data was not being hidden. It was being synchronized. Every known record of the coalition, every encounter, logged by other species. Every fragment of historical behavior was pulled into massive analytical models. Humanity did not ask how to escape the blockade. It asked why it existed. The distinction mattered. This was not a civilization trying to survive an event. This was a species trying to understand the mind behind it. As days passed, the coalition waited for signals that never came. No plea for negotiation, no declaration of surrender, no attempt at symbolic defiance. Earth remained operational, organized, and unnervingly quiet. To the fleet commanders, this silence became background noise, something to be ignored while patience did its work. They did not realize that silence was a choice. Humans had seen blockades before, in different forms, across their own violent history. They understood what came next because they had once done it to each other, and they had learned, painfully, what kind of response actually changed outcomes. The moment the alien fleet closed its ring, it believed the story had already been decided. The outcome, to them, was only a matter of time. But for Earth, the blockade was not an ending. It was a signal flare. Someone had finally revealed themselves. Someone had drawn a line around humanity and declared it contained. And humanity, rather than resisting immediately, chose to listen, calculate, and prepare. Because when humans are denied escape, they do not panic, they adapt. And when adaptation runs out, they innovate. The galaxy was watching Earth wait, unaware that it was witnessing the most dangerous phase of human response. Planning had begun. The alien fleet waited, and waiting was something it had perfected over centuries of conquest. Days passed, then weeks, measured not by human calendars but by orbital cycles and energy consumption. Charts that barely shifted. From the outside, Earth appeared unchanged, still rotating calmly beneath its cloud cover, still broadcasting the low-level noise of a living world. To the coalition's observers, this stability was an illusion, a fragile calm that would shatter once pressure accumulated. They expected to see shortages ripple through human infrastructure, political fractures erupt across national boundaries, and military posturing turn inward as leaders competed for dwindling resources. Instead, what their sensors recorded was something far more unsettling. Earth was becoming quieter, more efficient, more synchronized, as if the entire planet were slowly aligning to a single rhythm. Within the fleet's command hierarchy, this anomaly sparked debate, though it remained subdued and academic. Some analysts suggested humans were suppressing panic artificially, using propaganda and centralized control to maintain order. Others argued this was simply a delay, a final calm before inevitable collapse. The senior commanders dismissed both concerns. They had seen civilizations with far stronger social cohesion than humanity crumble under isolation. Time always revealed the truth, and time, they believed, was firmly on their side. So the fleet maintained its positions, weapons powered down, but ready. Confident that no escalation would be necessary, Earth would break itself apart soon enough. On the planet below, however, humanity was not merely enduring the blockade. It was reorganizing. Emergency councils dissolved national distinctions in ways no treaty ever had. Not through dramatic declarations, but through necessity. Data flowed freely between institutions that had once guarded it jealously. Civilian industries shifted production priorities overnight, guided by models that accounted for years of isolation rather than weeks. Supply chains rerouted, redundant systems activated, and experimental technologies long buried in classified archives were quietly brought back into discussion. There was no single leader issuing commands to the world. Instead, there was coordination, an emergent behavior born from shared understanding rather than authority. Military installations across Earth received identical directives, phrased in deliberately neutral language. Observe, measure, do not provoke, do not reveal. The emphasis was not on readiness for battle, but on comprehension. Humanity strategists understood that reacting too early would only confirm the coalition's assumptions. The fleet wanted to see fear, defiance, or desperation. It wanted noise. Earth gave it none. Instead, humans studied the blockade itself, mapping energy signatures, rotation patterns, and micro-adjustments in fleet formation. They analyzed how often ships rotated duty cycles, how power levels fluctuated during what passed for rest periods, and how communication bursts synchronized across different sectors of the ring. Piece by piece, a picture began to form. The most important discoveries were not technological, but behavioral. The fleet was disciplined, but not static. It followed routines optimized for endurance, not sudden conflict. Weapons remained charged, yet rarely recalibrated. Defensive formations assumed no meaningful resistance from within the ring. The coalition did not expect Earth to act, and that expectation shaped everything. Human analysts recognized this immediately. Assumptions were vulnerabilities, and the blockade was built on one enormous assumption: that humans would respond the way every other species had, that they would either submit or self-destruct. That patience alone would win. Beyond military circles, the psychological shift on Earth was just as profound. Fear did not vanish, but it transformed. It became quieter, more focused. People stopped asking when the aliens would attack and began asking why they had not. The absence of direct aggression gnawed at the collective consciousness more than open hostility ever could. The discomfort fueled curiosity rather than panic. Independent researchers, amateur astronomers, and data scientists contributed to global analysis efforts, feeding observations into shared networks. Humanity's greatest strength, long dismissed as chaotic diversity, became an asset. Millions of perspectives, all focused on the same problem, accelerated understanding at a rate no centralized intelligence could match. The alien fleet noticed none of this from their vantage point. Earth remained passive, no transmissions challenged the blockade, no probes tested the perimeter, no weapons fired blindly into space. To the coalition, this confirmed success. The planet was contained. The strategy was working. Some commanders even began discussing timelines for the next phase, when limited contact would be initiated from a position of absolute dominance. They spoke of terms, of compliance frameworks, of gradual integration under coalition oversight. Earth, in their minds, had already lost. It simply had not realized it yet. What they could not see was the shift happening beneath the surface, the slow, deliberate tightening of human focus. Earth was not waiting for permission to act. It was deciding how it wanted the galaxy to remember. This moment, humans understood that whatever came next would echo far beyond their own survival. A violent breakout might free the planet, but it would also confirm every fear the coalition held. Submission would spare lives in the short term, but condemn humanity to permanent subjugation. There was a third option, one that required patience equal to the fleet's own, and confidence strong enough to delay action until the moment truly mattered. As the blockade entered its second month, the coalition remained confident, even complacent. Their fleets held steady. Their projections showed no imminent threat. They believed they were watching a civilization slowly come to terms with its fate and reality. They were watching a species complete its assessment phase. Earth had learned how the cage was built. It was now asking a far more dangerous question. Not how to break it, but how to make its existence irrelevant. The fleet believed time was eroding humanity's resolve. They did not yet understand that time was sharpening it. By the third month of the blockade, the alien fleet had settled fully into routine. And routine bred blindness. Ships rotated positions with clockwork precision. Power consumption followed predictable cycles, and command transmissions adhered to strict hierarchies that had not changed in generations. From the coalition's perspective, Earth had become background noise, a contained system slowly bleeding momentum. Their attention drifted outward, toward other regions of the galaxy, other negotiations, other demonstrations of authority. The blockade remained, but it was no longer watched with urgency. That subtle shift, the quiet downgrade of attention, was precisely what humanity had been waiting for. On Earth, analysis had moved beyond observation and into synthesis. Human systems did not merely catalog alien behavior, they compared it against historical analogs drawn from humanity's own past. Naval blockades, siege warfare, economic isolation, and information denial were studied not as abstract concepts, but as lived experiences humanity had inflicted upon itself for centuries. The conclusion was unsettling and empowering at the same time. Blockades fail not when they are broken, but when they stop shaping behavior. The alien fleet controlled space, but it did not control time, and it did not control human adaptation. Earth's planners understood that survival was no longer the primary objective. Irreversibility was deep beneath the surface. Facilities that had once been experimental or politically controversial were reactivated under emergency authority. These were not weapon foundries in the traditional sense, but computational and infrastructural systems designed for extreme scenarios. Quantum-scale modeling arrays began simulating not battles, but outcomes. Every possible response was tested against one core question. Would this action change the coalition's long-term behavior toward humanity? Anything that merely forced a temporary retreat was discarded. Anything that escalated directly into open war was flagged as unacceptable. Humanity was not trying to win a fight. It was trying to end a pattern. As this strategic clarity emerged, Earth's outward behavior remained unchanged. No transmissions crossed the blockade. No probes challenged the perimeter. To the alien fleet, the planet appeared dormant, even resigned. This reinforced their confidence. They had seen worlds go quiet before, retreating inward as morale collapsed. What they had not seen was a civilization deliberately choosing silence as camouflage. Humans understood that visibility invited control, invisibility invited curiosity, and curiosity, when unmet, turned into uncertainty. Within the fleet, subtle discrepancies began to appear. Though no one connected them to Earth, automated systems flagged minor inefficiencies in formation density, negligible fluctuations in shield harmonics, and occasional synchronization delays in command relays. Individually, these issues were trivial. Collectively, they formed a pattern that would have concerned a more vigilant force. But the coalition trusted its systems implicitly. They had never been challenged by a world that remained completely non-reactive under full isolation. The idea that Earth might be influencing anything beyond its perimeter simply did not exist within their threat models. Meanwhile, human understanding of the blockade reached a critical threshold. Analysts confirmed that the fleet's containment strategy relied heavily on centralized command coherence rather than autonomous decision-making. The ring was strong, but its strength came from coordination, not redundancy. This was a legacy of dominance, not resilience. Systems designed to intimidate rarely needed to improvise. Humanity recognized this as a fundamental weakness, not because it was alien, but because it was familiar. Humans had built systems like this before. They knew exactly how brittle confidence could become when challenged indirectly. Public awareness of the situation evolved as well. Earth's population was not kept ignorant, but it was not flooded with raw data either. Instead, information was framed around endurance and observation. People were told the truth in measured tones. The planet was surrounded. Escape was impossible. War was not imminent. Life would continue. This honesty, stripped of dramatics, fostered an unexpected psychological stability. Panic thrives on uncertainty, and Earth, for the first time in its history, was facing an external threat with remarkable clarity. Humanity could not leave. The fleet would not strike. The unknown was smaller than it had ever been. The coalition misread this calm as compliance. Internal reports began to suggest that Earth might be a candidate for peaceful integration. Once resource pressure reached sufficient levels, some commanders even advocated for accelerating contact, believing humanity would be eager to negotiate. favorable terms before conditions worsen. These discussions were noted, archived, and delayed. There was no urgency. Earth was contained. Time would finish the work. The fleet did not notice that human infrastructure was not decaying under isolation. It was stabilizing, even strengthening, optimized for closed system efficiency rather than expansion. What no alien sensor could detect was the conceptual shift that had taken place within human strategy. Earth had stopped thinking like a besieged world and started thinking like a fixed point. The blockade defined a boundary, and boundaries, once understood, could be exploited in ways force never allowed. Humans were no longer asking how to get out. They were asking how the fleet would react if the concept of containment itself lost meaning. This was not a question of technology alone, but of psychology, perception, and precedent. Died as the third month ended. The alien fleet maintained its ring with unbroken confidence. From their perspective, nothing had changed. Earth remained silent. No resistance formed. No threat emerged. They believed they were watching a civilization slowly accept its fate. In reality, they were witnessing the final moments before humanity moved from analysis to action. The cage had been mapped, its assumptions exposed. As watchers lulled into certainty, all that remained was timing. And humanity had always known when to wait. The fourth month of the blockade marked the moment when the alien fleet stopped actively thinking about Earth at all, and that absence of attention was more decisive than any weapon. The containment ring remained intact, power level steady, formations precise, but command oversight loosened as confidence hardened into assumption. Earth had become a solved problem, categorized and filed away beneath more immediate galactic concerns. To the Coalition, the planet was no longer an active variable. It was a process unfolding exactly as predicted. Silence had become evidence of success. No one asked whether that silence was chosen. On Earth, the silence had weight. It was maintained, deliberately, protected as a strategic asset. No unauthorized signals escaped the planet. No accidental leaks pierced the blockade's informational net. Human communication infrastructure operated under layers of redundancy and discipline rarely achieved even during global wars. This was not enforced through fear or censorship, but through shared understanding. Every scientist, engineer, and analyst involved knew that a single premature action could collapse months of preparation. Humanity was holding its breath together, not out of helplessness, but out of focus. Deep within Earth's research complexes, theoretical work crossed a threshold. Models that had once been abstract began to align with observable data from the blockade itself. The fleet's containment strategy, though vast, was not absolute. It relied on maintaining control over known pathways and predictable behaviors. What it could not account for were interactions that did not resemble movement, communication, or attack. Human researchers identify phenomena the Coalition did not monitor closely, because no civilization had ever weaponized them at scale. The oversight was not technical incompetence. It was conceptual inertia. The Coalition's dominance had narrowed its imagination. None of this involved secret superweapons or miraculous technologies pulled from nowhere. What humanity was building was subtler and far more dangerous. It was a method of altering the environment in which the blockade existed, not by breaking through it, but by reshaping the assumptions that made it function. Earth's planners understood that power was not only measured in force projection, but in the ability to dictate which actions mattered. If the fleet controlled space, humanity would work with everything else space depended on: energy flows, time synchronization, information relevance. These were not targets the Coalition defended because they had never been attacked before. Public life on Earth adapted further. Rationing was introduced where necessary, but without desperation. Automation absorbed labor shifts. Education systems pivoted, emphasizing systems thinking and problem-solving over specialization. Even entertainment evolved, subtly reinforcing themes of patience, observation, and delayed action. Humanity was not preparing its population for imminent battle. It was conditioning itself for endurance. This collective psychological alignment was something no alien model had predicted. Most species fractured under prolonged stress. Humans, shaped by internal conflict and long histories of delayed crises, became steadier. Within the alien fleet, minor irregularities continued to accumulate. Communication lag between distant sections of the ring increased by fractions to small 2. Trigger alarms, energy redistribution protocols compensated automatically, masking the cause rather than revealing it. Analysts attributed these effects to cosmic background fluctuations, stellar interference, or simple system aging. None of them traced the patterns back to Earth, because Earth was not doing anything that resembled aggression. It remained passive. Sealed and silent, the coalition trusted what it could see, and what it could see was compliance. What they could not see was intent. Humanity had finished asking whether its plan would work. The question now was how visible the result needed to be. Earth's leadership understood that disappearance carried meaning, but ambiguity carried power. If the fleet vanished cleanly, the galaxy might never learn why. If it vanished missily, the coalition might frame the narrative. The outcome needed to be undeniable, yet restrained enough to prevent immediate retaliation. This balance required precision not just in execution, but in timing. Humanity was no longer reacting to the blockade. It was choreographing the moment the galaxy would notice something was wrong. As the 4th month drew to a close, the coalition began preliminary discussions about the next stage of containment. These were procedural conversations focused on resource extraction rights, administrative oversight, and cultural compliance benchmarks. Earth was spoken of in abstract terms, reduced to population figures and industrial capacity. No one in those rooms considered the possibility that the blockade itself was under evaluation. No one imagined that the planet inside the ring had already decided the fleet's fate. The idea that a contained world could act without breaking containment did not exist within coalition doctrine. On Earth, the final internal reviews were completed. Systems were synchronized down to tolerances so narrow they bordered on theoretical limits. Fail-safes were layered upon fail-safes, not to prevent damage to the fleet, but to prevent unintended escalation. Humanity was acutely aware of the line it was about to cross. This was not self-defense in the traditional sense. It was a message, and messages, once sent, could not be recalled. Earth was not afraid of the coalition's response. It was determined to shape it. The alien fleet continued to wait, confident in its dominance, unaware that the most dangerous phase of the operation had already passed. The cage was no longer a tool of control. It was a stage, and humanity, having mastered the art of waiting, was ready to perform asterisk. The 5th month began without spectacle, and that was precisely the point. From the coalition's perspective, the blockade remained flawless, the containment ring unbroken, the balance of power unchanged, energy readings held within acceptable margins, formation geometry stayed mathematically elegant, command traffic flowed along familiar channels. Nothing appeared wrong enough to justify concern, and so concern never formed. The fleet had reached the most dangerous state a dominant force could occupy: comfort. They were no longer watching Earth. They were assuming Earth, and assumption, humanity knew, was the first step toward loss. On Earth, activation did not arrive as a single moment, but as a cascade of imperceptible shifts. Systems long synchronized began operating at their final parameters, slipping from passive observation into controlled influence. Nothing crossed the blockade physically. No signal pierced its jamming fields directly. Instead, interactions occurred through layers the coalition did not consider vulnerable because they did not resemble communication or attack. Humans adjusted patterns the fleet depended on without realizing it depended on them. Minor changes in stellar energy absorption, subtle manipulations of background radiation reflections, variations so small they blended seamlessly into cosmic noise, each one meaningless alone. Together, they formed leverage, The Coalition's automated systems compensated instantly. As designed, power rerouted, shield harmonics adjusted, command algorithms smoothed out discrepancies before they reached organic oversight. This efficiency was the fleet's pride and its weakness. The more the systems compensated, the more they concealed the underlying cause. Human analysts watched this feedback loop with clinical focus, confirming projections refined over months. The fleet was stabilizing itself into dependence on correction. Every automated adjustment reduced the margin for human oversight. Within the Coalition's own command structure, control was becoming abstracted, distanced from decision-makers who no longer felt the need to intervene. Psychologically, Earth crossed a threshold as well. Fear receded into the background, replaced by a shared, almost unsettling calm. Humanity had accepted that whatever happened next would define its place in the galaxy. For generations, this acceptance did not breed recklessness. It bred restraint. Every action was measured against consequence, not just immediate survival. Earth's leadership was acutely aware that the fleet represented more than ships and crews. It represented a precedent of galactic order enforced through isolation. If the order collapsed too violently, the galaxy might respond with unified aggression. Humanity's objective was not to terrify the stars. It was to change how they calculated risk. Inside the fleet, subtle strain began to surface among crews. Though it remained unarticulated, long-duration containment duty was monotonous. And monotony eroded vigilance. Reports of minor system inconsistencies increased, but each was resolved before it could escalate. Officers trusted the automation. That had never failed them. No alarms sounded, no red flags persisted. The blockade held. From the Coalition's viewpoint, Earth was simply enduring the inevitable. Some commanders even noted with faint admiration how long the humans had lasted. Without visible collapse, unaware that endurance was not the metric that mattered anymore. Human modeling confirmed that the window was opening. The fleet's reliance on automated correction meant that any sudden withdrawal of stabilizing assumptions would propagate rapidly across the ring. This was not sabotage in the traditional sense. No system would be destroyed, no hull breached. Instead, coherence itself would be challenged. Humanity was preparing to test whether a structure designed to dominate through order could survive a moment where order stopped being meaningful. The distinction was subtle, but decisive. Earth still did not speak. No message warned the fleet. No declaration marked the transition from waiting to acting. The silence remained intact, heavy and deliberate. From a narrative perspective, nothing had changed. From a systemic perspective, everything had. The blockade was no longer shaping Earth's behavior. Earth was shaping the blockade's future state. The cage had not been weakened. It had been understood, and understanding was proving far more dangerous than force. As the fifth month progressed, Coalition Command began receiving aggregate reports indicating increased computational load across fleet systems. The data suggested nothing catastrophic, only an unusual convergence of routine corrections. Analysts flagged it for long-term review, assigning it low priority. The fleet had handled worse anomalies near pulsars and unstable stars. Earth, they believed, was inert by comparison. No one suggested heightened alert status. No one reduced reliance on automation. The system that had always worked was still working, and so trust remained unbroken. On Earth, the final confirmation arrived quietly. Simulations aligned with live data within acceptable variance. The theoretical had become practical. Humanity had reached the point of no return, not because it could not stop, but because stopping would now mean accepting the old order. Earth's planners made the same decision. Humans had made countless times before when confronted with unjust systems. They chose to proceed, not out of hatred or pride, but out of necessity. Survival was no longer enough. Autonomy had to be asserted in a way the galaxy could not ignore or misunderstand. The Coalition fleet continued its vigil, unaware that the blockade had ceased to function in the way it was designed. The ring still existed, the ship still held, position. But control, the quiet certainty of dominance, was beginning to slip, not through violence, but through neglect. Humanity had waited patiently for the moment when no one was truly watching. That moment had arrived, and with it, the countdown began, not to an explosion, but to an absence the galaxy was not prepared to explain. The moment arrived without drama, without alarms or sudden violence, and for the reason it passed unnoticed by those least prepared to confront it. Within the coalition fleet's command lattice, a routine synchronization check failed to resolve. Cleanly, not catastrophically, not even visibly, but enough to require a secondary pass. Then a tertiary, automated oversight flagged the anomaly, initiated deeper diagnostics, and quietly expanded the correction window. From the system's perspective, this was acceptable behavior. From humanity's perspective, it was the signal they had been waiting for. The blockade had encountered a condition it could not immediately categorize, and in that hesitation, authority began to fracture. On Earth, observers did not celebrate. There were no cheers, no triumphant declarations. Instead, there was stillness. A collective holding of breath as analysts confirmed that the deviation followed predicted pathways. The coalition's systems were not failing. They were reasoning themselves into complexity, layering assumption upon assumption in an attempt to preserve equilibrium. Human intervention remained indirect, mediated through environmental interactions, and probabilistic nudges so subtle they left no identifiable signature. Nothing the fleet could point to as an attack existed, only outcomes, only consequences unfolding without a visible cause. The coalition command hierarchy began to feel the strain. Reports from separate sectors described similar synchronization. Delays, each explained away as local variants. Command AI recommended patience, organic officers, accustomed to trusting those recommendations, approved without debate. It was easier to believe in noise than to contemplate the alternative. To accept that Earth might be exerting influence without transmitting signals or deploying weapons would require rewriting foundational doctrines of control. The coalition had never encountered a civilization that refused to play by the visible rules of power. Within the containment ring, micro-adjustments accumulated. Shield frequencies oscillated more frequently than optimal. Energy reserves fluctuated within safe limits, but did so unpredictably. Formation cohesion required constant recalculation. None of this impaired combat readiness in any obvious way, but it eroded certainty. Crews began to notice that systems felt busy. Consoles updated more often. Status indicators refreshed with unusual frequency. The fleet was working harder to appear unchanged, and the harder it worked, the more it revealed its dependence on uninterrupted coherence. Humanity's strategy was not to break the blockade, but to ask it a question it could not answer. What happens when a system designed to impose order encounters an environment that refuses to be categorized? Earth did not resist containment directly. It became informationally expensive. Every attempt by the fleet to model Earth's state produced divergent projections. Data did not converge. Predictions widened instead of narrowing. This violated the coalition's expectations more deeply than aggression ever could. Hostile actors could be countered. Unpredictable ones required humility, and humility was not embedded in the fleet's design. As discrepancies grew, coalition analysts escalated the issue to strategic review. For the first time, Earth's status was no longer described as passive. New terminology appeared in reports, cautious and vague, anomalous, non-compliant, atypical. None of the words implied threat, but all of them implied discomfort. Command requested expanded telemetry. The blockade increased observational intensity, and in doing so, it stepped further into the trap humanity had prepared. The more closely the fleet observed, the more it relied on models that no longer stabilized. On Earth, planners authorized the next phase. Constraints that had been held in reserve were relaxed, not to accelerate outcomes, but to sustain them. This was the most delicate part of the process. Push too hard, and the fleet might recognize the pattern, move too slowly, and the coalition could adapt. Humanity threaded the narrow space between notice and neglect. Maintaining ambiguity is a strategic asset. The galaxy did not yet need to fear Earth. It needed to be confused by it. Inside the fleet, the first true question arose, though no one voiced it aloud. If Earth was not attacking, not communicating, not complying, and not collapsing, then what was it doing? The question circulated silently, suppressed by routine and protocol. But it altered perception. Crews began to look at the planet differently, not as a trapped world awaiting judgment, but as an active variable whose behavior could not be reduced to known categories. The psychological shift was subtle, but irreversible. Coalition Command ordered a comprehensive system audit, scheduled to roll out over several cycles. It was a prudent response, delayed only by confidence that time favored containment. Humanity's models showed otherwise. Audits required stability to establish baselines. Stability was the one thing Earth was no longer providing. The window was narrowing, not for Earth, but for the fleet's ability to restore narrative control over the situation. Once doubt entered the system, certainty could not simply be reasserted. As the 6th month drew toward its close, the blockade still held in every visible sense. Ships maintained position. Weapons remained powered. No human vessel crossed the ring. To an external observer, nothing had changed, yet within the coalition's own data streams, coherence was thinning, stretched across too many compensations, too many unresolved assumptions. Earth had not broken the rules. It had made them insufficient. Humanity waited, not for failure, but for recognition. The moment the coalition admitted, even internally, that it did not understand what was happening, the balance would shift. Power did not belong to those who enforced order blindly. It belonged to those who could redefine it somewhere within. The fleet's vast command structure, an unanswered question lingered, growing heavier with each cycle, and questions, once asked, had a way of reshaping entire civilizations. By the time the coalition audit formally began, the blockade had already crossed a psychological threshold it could not retreat from. Systems were still nominal, formations remained intact. No alarms justified emergency action, yet the act of auditing itself signaled something profound. The fleet no longer trusted its own assumptions. Every layer of command, from automated overseers to organic admirals, now treated Earth not as a solved problem, but as an unresolved equation. That shift carried weight, because coalition doctrine was built on the belief that uncertainty was temporary and always resolvable through sufficient observation. Humanity was quietly dismantling the belief. The audit expanded inward before it expanded outward. Fleet Command first examined itself, combing through decision trees, predictive matrices, and adaptive heuristics for internal drift. Minor deviations were found, corrected, then reappeared elsewhere. No single flaw could be isolated. The system behaved like a structure under constant, gentle pressure, flexing without breaking, redistributing strain in ways that defied clean analysis. To the coalition's engineers, this was deeply unsettling. Their architectures were designed to localize problems. Earth's influence refused localization. As scrutiny intensified, the blockade sensors fed Earth more data than ever before. Every scan, every spectral analysis, every gravimetric reading layered additional complexity into the fleet's models. Human strategists had anticipated this response. Observation was not neutral. It altered the system doing the observing. Earth's environment, its orbital traffic, even its electromagnetic noise floor, had been shaped to respond dynamically to scrutiny, not in ways that violated physics, but in ways that multiplied interpretive pathways. The fleet saw more, but understood less. Within the coalition's organic command staff, quiet debates began to surface, not arguments, not yet, but moments of hesitation during briefings. questions phrased carefully to avoid appearing insubordinate. Why had Earth not attempted negotiation? Why had it not tested the blockade? Why did its activity levels fluctuate without correlating to any recognizable strategic pattern? The official answers remained unchanged. Humanity was assumed to be waiting, stalling, or preparing. But beneath those explanations was an emerging discomfort. Waiting for what? Earth, meanwhile, continued to behave as though the blockade were a background condition rather than an existential threat. Civilian infrastructure evolved within constraints. Orbital platforms adjusted their roles. Communications architecture shifted toward redundancy and internal coherence rather than external reach. None of it looked like preparation for war. That absence gnawed at coalition confidence. The fleet had been trained to interpret escalation and submission. It struggled to interpret indifference. The audit's second phase expanded outward, comparing Earth's behavior to archived cases of contained civilizations. No parallels held. Even cultures that had chosen silence exhibited statistical patterns of internal consolidation. Earth's patterns did not consolidate, they diversified. Human activity distributed itself across countless low-signature channels, reducing the strategic value of any single target from a military perspective. This was inefficient. From a systems perspective, it was resilient. The fleet's models flagged the discrepancy but could not assign an intent. Deep within the coalition's decision frameworks, adaptive routines attempted to compensate by increasing control resolution, more precise tracking, finer-grained simulations, narrower tolerances. This response, logical within coalition doctrine, accelerated the problem. Each increase in resolution multiplied the number of variables requiring reconciliation. Earth's behavior generated complexity faster than the fleet could compress it. The system began to lag, not in performance, but in confidence. Predictions required disclaimers. Disclaimers required oversight. Oversight slowed response. Human planners observed these developments. With measured restraint, there was no rush. The goal was not collapse, but imbalance. A fleet that doubted its understanding was a fleet that hesitated, and hesitation eroded authority far beyond the tactical domain. Earth's leaders understood that the coalition governed not just through force, but through the appearance of inevitability. If inevitability could be questioned, compliance across the galaxy would follow suit. The first external ripple appeared in distant systems, far from Earth's orbit. Coalition patrols reported minor deviations in response timing, as command pathways rerouted to accommodate audit traffic. Insignificant delays, individually meaningless, but cumulative. Peripheral commanders adapted locally, making small decisions without awaiting central confirmation. This was encouraged doctrine under stress conditions, yet it marked a departure from the coalition's preferred mode of unified action. Earth had not disrupted the fleet directly. It had stretched it. Within the blockade, crews began to feel watched by their own systems. Diagnostics ran more frequently. Behavioral monitoring tightened. Organic officers found themselves second-guessed by predictive advisories that no longer spoke with absolute certainty. Recommendations came with probabilities instead of directives. Confidence scores dipped from near perfect to merely high. This subtle change altered command psychology. Decisions required justification. Justification required time. Time was a resource the coalition had always assumed it possessed in abundance. Earth's silence amplified the effect. No demands, no messages, no threats. The absence forced the coalition to fill the narrative void with speculation. Some analysts proposed that humanity was intentionally avoiding recognizability, adopting a form of strategic opacity. Others dismissed the idea as anthropocentric projection. Yet the data did not support simpler explanations. Earth's behavior was not random. It was structured, adaptive, and internally coherent. It simply did not align with known strategic archetypes. As the 7th month approached, the audit reached a preliminary conclusion that unsettled senior command. The blockade remained effective in physical terms, but informational dominance could no longer be guaranteed. Earth had become a system that responded to observation in ways that degraded the observer's certainty. This did not constitute a threat under coalition definitions. It constituted something worse, an exception. Exceptions required new rules, and new rules required consensus. Consensus, under conditions of doubt, was slow. Humanity sensed the shift without celebrating it. The galaxy was not yet aware of what Earth represented, but the coalition was beginning to feel it. Power was no longer unidirectional. The fleet still surrounded the planet, but psychologically, it was no longer above it. Earth was no longer merely contained. It was being studied, and in that act of study, the coalition had begun to change itself. The weight of observation settled heavily on the blockade. Every skin deepened the mystery. Every attempt to simplify made the system more complex. Somewhere within the coalition's vast hierarchy, a realization edged closer to articulation. Control required understanding, and understanding was slipping away. Earth had not fired a shot. It had not broken containment. It had done something far more dangerous. It had made the act of watching it costly. Asterisk. The coalition's response to uncertainty was always escalation through structure. When understanding weakened, authority tightened. New command layers were inserted above the blockade, not to replace existing leadership, but to oversee it, audit it, and validate every decision before execution. On paper, this restored confidence. In practice, it introduced friction into a system that had relied on near-instant consensus for centuries. Orders now traveled longer paths. Confirmations took longer to return. The fleet still moved as one, but the movement felt heavier, as though inertia itself had increased. Earth registered the change immediately, not through espionage or intercepted transmissions, but through pattern drift. Orbital vectors adjusted more slowly. Patrol cycles lost their precise symmetry. The electromagnetic background around the blockade thickened with redundant signaling as command. Nodes cross-checked one another. Humanity had modeled this outcome decades earlier. Large hierarchies under stress did not fail loudly. They accumulated delay, and delay was detectable. Delay was exploitable. The Coalition's Strategic Council convened for what was officially termed a posture reassessment. Unofficially, it was an attempt to reassert narrative dominance. Earth could not be allowed to remain undefined. The galaxy needed clarity, and clarity required a declaration. Options were presented. Force compliance through limited demonstration. Initiate force contact protocols, or maintain the blockade while accelerating internal reforms. None satisfied all criteria. Demonstration risked escalation without comprehension. Force contact risked revealing uncertainty. Maintenance risked normalization of doubt. As debate stretched, time continued to work against the fleet. Peripheral systems began to notice subtle shifts. Coalition patrols were slower to respond to routine incidents. Automated governance nodes flagged rising variance in decision timing. Nothing that justified alarm, but enough to trigger curiosity. Curiosity was dangerous. The Coalition's authority depended on predictability. Earth's existence inside a permanent exception zone disrupted the predictability across the network. Within the blockade, morale degraded not through fear, but through contradiction. Crews were told the situation was stable, yet audits intensified. They were told Earth was contained, yet command treated it as a priority anomaly. They were told no action was required, yet readiness drills became more frequent and less clearly defined. Humans had anticipated this psychological pressure. Systems designed to dominate through certainty struggled when certainty itself became the stressor. Earth's activity subtly shifted, not in volume, but in distribution. More processes moved underground, deeper into planetary infrastructure and decentralized orbital clusters. Energy flows flattened, communication paths multiplied, laterally instead of hierarchically. To Coalition analysts, it looked like an efficiency. To human planners, it was inoculation. No single disruption could cascade. No decapitation strike could cripple response. Earth was not hardening against attack. It was dissolving points of failure. The first overt sign of strain appeared when a coalition auxiliary fleet, tasked with reinforcing the blockade perimeter, requested clarification on engagement parameters. The request itself was unprecedented. Parameters had always been implicit. Their absence now forced explicit articulation, and articulation exposed disagreement. The request traveled upward, gathering commentary, revisions, and conditional clauses. By the time a response returned, the window for relevance had passed. The auxiliary fleet held position, awaiting further instruction that did not come. Human observers marked the moment quietly. It confirmed a hypothesis long debated within Earth's strategic councils. Control systems optimized for dominance struggled when faced with targets that refused to behave as targets. Humanity was not resisting. It was not complying. It was existing on its own terms, and that autonomy was incompatible with coalition. Governance models died as weeks passed. The Strategic Council authorized a limited informational probe, a message carefully constructed, stripped of threat or concession. Bureau ADCAST toward Earth's orbital networks. It framed the blockade as a stabilizing measure and invited dialogue on terms of coexistence. The transmission was flawless by coalition standards, balanced, reasonable, unavoidable. Earth acknowledged receipt automatically, as it acknowledged all external signals, and then did nothing. The silence that followed was heavier than any rejection. Coalition analysts waited for outrage, demands, or at least clarification. None came. Earth's internal activity continued unchanged. The message had been absorbed, contextualized, and deprioritized. For the first time, the coalition confronted a civilization that did not orient its future around coalition response. The realization unsettled even the most senior strategists across the galaxy. The ripple intensified. Client species began asking cautious questions. Why was Earth still blockaded? What threat did it pose? Why had no resolution occurred? Coalition representatives provided standard answers, but the confidence behind them thinned. Authority without clarity invited scrutiny, and scrutiny exposed the cost of maintaining control over something that refused definition. Within Earth's councils, the moment was recognized as a turning point, not a victory, but a transition. The coalition had shifted from enforcer to negotiator without achieving understanding. Its posture was no longer inevitable. Humanity had not outmatched the fleet technologically or militarily. It had outlasted the coalition's certainty that endurance was its strength. The blockade still held. The ship still encircled the planet. Weapons remained charged, but the balance had changed. Every additional day demanded justification. Every justification exposed fragility. Control was no longer free. It consumed attention, resources, and legitimacy. Earth did not need to break the blockade. It only needed to remain what it was: complex, adaptive, and uncontained in ways that mattered. By the end of the 8th phase, Coalition Command faced a reality it had never formally encountered. Maintaining dominance over Earth was possible, but costly. Releasing Earth was risky, but clarifying. The choice ahead was no longer about power. It was about precedent. Whatever decision came next would echo far beyond Sol. Earth waited, not in fear, not in defiance. It waited with the patience of a system that had learned something the galaxy had not yet accepted. Control had limits, and those limits could be reached without a single shot fired. Asterisk. The 9th month dawned with no fireworks, no warning, and no declaration. And that was precisely the point. From the coalition's perspective, Earth remained a planet encircled by a fleet, a system under watchful containment, a minor inconvenience in the vast mechanics of galactic order. Ships hummed in orbit, shields glimmered in discipline arcs, and weapons arrays rested poised yet unused. Command data indicated stability. Observers saw predictability, yet beneath these metrics, the most fundamental law of the blockade had quietly shifted. Control was no longer a given. Authority now required justification. And justification exposed the cracks the coalition had spent decades hiding within the fleet. Auxiliary commands reported rising computational load, minor misalignments in synchronization, and subtle discrepancies in predictive models individually. None of these warranted alarm. Collectively, they told a story the coalition's leaders were not ready to face. Earth had become an anomaly that could not be reduced to known frameworks. Automated systems recalibrated endlessly. Human officers debated endlessly, and every correction introduced new uncertainty. Observation itself had become a tool of escalation, and the object of observation had mastered its own response to it. Earth, in contrast, remained composed. There was no visible mobilization, no broadcast of dominance, no overt act of aggression. Humans had anticipated every sensor, every audit, every minute of scrutiny. Their responses were subtle, almost invisible shifts in orbital traffic, adjustments in energy absorption, variations in electromagnetic emissions. Each adjustment alone was meaningless. Together, they formed a web that subtly redistributed the coalition's confidence, attention, and assumptions. The planet did not resist. It redefined what it meant to be contained. Coalition Command convened a full-scale review. For the first time, senior officers openly admitted doubt. They discussed the unthinkable, a system existing outside the rules the galaxy had imposed. What would it mean if Earth could not be controlled? What precedent would that set for other species? Questions once considered theoretical now dominated strategic deliberations. Every contingency plan relied on assumptions that were no longer valid. Every projection carried the caveat, assumes Earth will comply. But compliance was no longer a certainty. Analysts recorded that the fleet's collective attention was being consumed by verification rather than oversight. Every subsystem was tasked with watching, recalculating, and predicting, and yet uncertainty grew with each cycle. Earth did not respond to these measures because it did not need to. Humanity had outlasted the psychological machinery of domination, demonstrating that control required more than numbers, more than weapons, more than presence. Control required comprehension, and comprehension had proven elusive. The silence from Earth became deafening. No communication, no sign of surrender, no challenge issued. Yet the absence of action communicated a clarity that no threat could replicate. The planet was not negotiating. It was stating a principle that autonomy cannot be overridden by proximity. That strategy is superior to force, and that restraint can convey power as effectively as destruction. Every ship in orbit, every command protocol, and every officer on duty registered the same truth in subtle, cumulative ways. The fleet had been invited to recognize its own limits elsewhere in the galaxy. News of the blockade's peculiar status spread through whispers among client systems. An allied species, analysts and historians debated endlessly. How could a single civilization withstand such scrutiny without breaking, bowing, or reacting violently? Was this evidence of technological supremacy, strategic genius, or some intangible quality that defied categorization? Even the most seasoned diplomats began to question doctrines that had once seemed immutable. Humanity had become a lesson, an enigma, and an exemplar simultaneously. As the 9th month drew to a close, Coalition Command acknowledged, silently and internally, that the blockade's purpose had shifted. It was no longer to dominate Earth, but to witness it. Every ship, every sensor, every command loop became a record of a civilization that could endure observation without capitulation. The power imbalance had not been erased. It had been reframed. Humanity had not destroyed the fleet. It had transformed the very meaning of containment, turning the act of being watched into an exercise of silent authority. In the final hours, the most senior admiral aboard the Coalition's flagship spoke quietly to a subordinates cluster. We maintain position, yet we have already lost control. There was no panic, only recognition. The fleet remained operational, the blockade remained in place, yet nothing would ever be the same. Systems optimized for obedience had encountered a system that did not obey. And the lesson was profound. Dominance without understanding is temporary, fragile, and ultimately hollowed Earth continued its orbit, unremarkable in appearance, yet monumental in implication. Ships remained poised, and sensors scanned endlessly. But the planet did not flinch, did not rush, did not respond. Humanity had done what no fleet had expected. It had survived, not by aggression or deception, but by enduring, observing, and understanding the mechanics of power more deeply than those who thought themselves masters. The galaxy had been forced to reconsider its assumptions. The fleet had been forced to reconsider itself. And somewhere in the silent calculus of countless systems, a singular truth emerged: autonomy. Patience and insight are weapons more subtle and enduring than fleets, more lasting than fear, more certain than obedience. And so the blockade persisted, not as a sign of control, but as a monument to what it meant to be human. Civilization could be surrounded, contained, and observed, yet humanity remained intact, unreadable, unyielding, and free. The fleet had not failed to destroy Earth. It had failed to comprehend it. The lesson would echo through the stars for generations, and for the first time, the galaxy understood, truly and irrevocably, that humans were not merely a species to be managed. They were a force to be reckoned with, patient, calculating, and utterly self-assured. Asterisk.